Good morning. Welcome to the PPM Pinball Expo. This is the 5th Pinball Expo, and it's the biggest pinball show in the world. If you haven't been, I encourage you to come. If you have, I encourage you to return. I'd like to talk today about a couple of the games that are here on the floor. This game is an Alibaba, a Gottlieb game. It's one of 7, actually, 7 games that are collectively known as the Fairy Tale series. The other games in that series are Humpty Dumpty, Lady Robin Hood, Cinderella, Jack and Jill, Old King Cole, and Alice in Wonderland. Now, the thing that was interesting about the Fairy Tale series, it began with Humpty Dumpty. And if you're at all familiar with pinball history, you might remember that Humpty Dumpty was the very first game to have flippers. But it didn't have just a single flipper. In fact, it had 6 flippers, 3 on each side. And they operated independently side by side. Humpty was the first. And an interesting aspect of these 7 games is that they clearly reveal themselves as being of pre-flipper design. The flippers are kind of add-ons, and they weren't really designed to be targeting devices at the outset. That only came about when the manufacturers understood their potential. So they were there, but all you could kind of hope to do was, if you were adroit, you could maybe move the ball up the playfield a little bit. But this is Alibaba, very, very pretty back glass, and you can probably see the graphics on the playfield. Heavy with Roy Parker art, Parker girls, always buxom, always enticing, and always interesting. It's me again. This time I'm here with Mystic Marvel. Mystic Marvel is a game that was made in 1954 by D. Gottlieb and Company, and it was one of many very successful card-themed games. People came to think of Gottlieb as the king of cards because they returned to that theme time and time again. Another thing that's distinctive about Mystic Marvel, it was the first to have what came to be known as the double award feature. The double award feature was kind of interesting because if you inserted 2 coins before you shot your first ball and you ended up winning games, it doubled the number of games that you were rewarded. So if you were to win 2 games, you'd get 4. If you won 4 games, you'd get 8. And interestingly enough, it was a feature that turned out not to be particularly frequently used. It was usually used only if somebody had replays and was willing to risk the replays to play for the double award. But the other games in the double award series were Hawaiian Beauty, Diamond Lil, 4 Bells, Dragonette, Lady Luck, Jockey Club, and Daisy May, some of which you'll see later. Some nice features about this game, not the least of them being Parker's artwork, which is, again, spectacular. The way this game worked, there were 3 sets of cards that you were asked to put out. The rollovers at the top were 8s, the rollovers in the center were 9s, and then you had 10 through ace as rollover buttons on the playfield. If you completed the 8 sequence, it would light the target for a single special. If you completed the 9 sequence, it would light the target for special. If you completed this sequence, it would light it for special. So it was conceivable that you could have the target lit for 3 free games at a time. Of course, if you had the double coin feature activated and you hit the target, you'd get 6 games. Very interesting game, low scoring game for the period. Usually Gottlieb games were denominated up to 7,900,000. This one only went to 5,900,000, and there weren't many places on the game to score, real score. They had 100,000 rebound rubbers left and right. The out hole was 500,000, and these 2 gigantic oil barrel holes were 500,000. These lit occasionally for special. That was dependent upon the contacts on the stepping unit, the 10,000 stepping unit. And all in all, it was a very fun, very good playing game. This is Gottlieb's 1951 Mermaid. Beautiful back glass, beautiful play field. And what's depicted here in this back glass diorama is a fisherman. And the fisherman is not doing too well because every time he pulls his line up, instead of finding a fish, he finds instead an old boot. This is one of very few back glass animated games from this era. Others were much later in the late 50s. Gottlieb's Knockout had a wonderful animation unit on the playfield, and the two of those games are probably among the most desirable of any of the wood rail games. Typically beautiful Roy Parker artwork. Here's the Chief Mermaid, and she's dangling a hook with a little fish on it. We have mermaids riding fish for the 100,000 scoring. We have a Jules Verne-esque lady diver with a diving helmet. We have an octopus. We have a sea snake. And here's the buried treasure chest where the points start to add up. They're rear lit, as was the case of all games of this period. There's so many interesting aspects to Mermaid. Many ways to win, again typical of the wood rail games, something that's been lost in the modern era. You could win on score, you could win on points. Every time you scored a point, our fisherman would pull his boot out of the water again. Of course, this was kind of a diversion for the player, but onlookers really got excited about it. Strangely enough, as beautiful and as much fun as this game is, it was a very low production run for the period. It was only about 600 pieces. It was released at a time when there was an enormous amount of competitive activity in the market. Bingo games, which were essentially gambling pinball games, were at their height. Both Bally and United were making them. Coin-operated shuffle alleys, shuffle bowling, which started in the late 40s, had become huge, usually at a dime a play, games that would accept up to 6 players at a time. So single-player pinball was struggling across the board, which accounts in many respects for the low production run of this game. Too bad, because in today's market, perhaps 1% of the production of games of this era survive, which means that if we're lucky, there might be 6 to 10 of these still kicking around. This one is in reasonably good shape. It was a result of melding 2 poorer games to make one good one, which is a decision that I regret having made because there's such a demand for this piece. Play features are interesting. You have a 1 through 7 bumper sequence. They must be put out in order. And by doing so, the first time, you light the 100,000 when lit, and they remain lit through the duration of the game. If you put them out a second time, it lights the kick holes for 500,000 every time you go into them. If you put them out a third time, ooh, I guess you can't see it on your camera there, Will, but it lights the kick holes for special, and they award a replay. As I said, you can also win on score and points are scored either by running over the rollover buttons and activating the back box, or as you move up, you can also score them with a 1 point when lit bumper. An interesting feature, if you're able to catch this is a blocking gate. There it is. This was a feature that Gottlieb used 6 or 7 times, and what it did was it compensated for the rather wide gap on the play field and permitted you to get a certain score before it dropped. In the case of Mermaid, it allowed you to score a single point before it dropped. Watch. Now it drops. However, one of 2 things could happen that would reactivate it and give you another opportunity. For instance, when this green gate button was lit and you rolled over it, the gate would come up again. Here's another feature. Now when I score this point, the gate's going to drop again. Now, for some reason, if you're lucky enough to have the ball up in this area when the gate is down, and roll over in the runway, which is normally activated when the ball is first shot, it will indeed bring the gate up again. Very cool game, beautifully designed. I think I had mentioned earlier that there are 4 cyclonic kickers on the game, and they're mounted in the horizontal position. It's the only time that I'm aware of that Nyan's ever used this unique design. It resulted in a lot of cross-board ball action. This will kind of give you, maybe it won't give you a sense of it. I tilted. And where does the tilt appear? And I'm not saying the tilt. In any event, a wonderful game, a rare game. A lot of people have come to this expo, not exclusively to see this game, but it has created quite a draw because there's so few of them. I'm Gordon Hasse. I've been into pinball from the time I was about 8 years old. I grew up in Philadelphia in the 50s, and at that time, pinball was ubiquitous. Philadelphia was an entirely open city. They ran amusement pinball. They also ran bingo pinball in adult locations like bars or in sectioned off areas of arcades in the downtown area. The first game I ever remember playing, as I said, I think I was about 8 years old, was a Williams 20 grand. And that was located in a little greasy spoon about a block from where I lived called Spurl's. It was at the end of a trolley route, and mostly it was populated by drivers of the trolleys who would come in and get their coffee and their hamburger or whatever. So it was a little intimidating for a sub-teen to wander into that venue, but I was so drawn by the machines that I couldn't resist. And I guess I caught the fever right from the outset. I pestered my parents for years to buy me a used machine, and they were kind enough to do that. And by the time I was 16 or 17, I actually had 3 or 4 games in my collection. The first game I ever owned was a Happy Daze, Gottlieb 1952. I also owned a 1950, it was a Williams pitch and bat called Star Series. I had a Just 21, which was a 1950 Gottlieb game. And I later acquired a Madison Square Garden, also Gottlieb. And I'm trying to remember, Green Pastures, a 1954 Gottlieb game. I found the 2 of those huddled underneath a tarpaulin on the balcony of a motel on Rio Grande Avenue in Wildwood, New Jersey. And I think I paid the princely sum of $50 a piece for those 2 games. When I went away to college, my interest in pinball kind of waned, although I did take the Green Pastures down, and it sat in the fraternity house next to the bar, and we played it for a couple of years. But over one summer, somebody decided they needed it more than I did, so it disappeared. And ultimately, I have none of those games in my final collection. That is to say, none of the games I owned as a child. I did ultimately buy those games again as an adult. I got out of college, went to graduate school, moved to New York, and all that time my pinball interest had waned and become much less important than other things that were happening in my life. But when I discovered that these 50s vintage games were still obtainable, it rekindled my interest. And the first game I ever owned as an adult was a Gottlieb 1954 Dragonette, which I bought from one of the pioneer pinball dealers. This was probably mid-70s, a guy named Ira Warren, who had a business selling coin-operated machines on K Street in Brooklyn. So I bought that from him. The next 2 games I owned were an Ace High, also a Gottlieb, and a Harbor Lights that I bought from Steve Young. Now, anybody associated with pinball knows the name Steve Young, and Steve and I became fast friends. He and I published the first collector's publication for pinball people called the Pinball Collectors Quarterly, and that ran about 1.5 years, and I think we were too far ahead of the curve, and we just couldn't sustain the the readership to make it a viable business opportunity. But it did give us a lot of fun, and we met a lot of people, and we kind of, I like to think, created the critical mass that was needed to really kick off the hobby. Steve and I sent that list of our early subscribers, which I think was on the order of 400 people, to Rob Burke and Mike Pasak, and they used that as the invitation list for the first Pinball Expo in Chicago. And then things kind of took off from there. One of the things that I should have mentioned earlier that ignited my interest in collecting these games is a gentleman named Wayne Morgan. And Wayne is a pop culture curator. He's Canadian. And back in 1974, Wayne launched the first exhibit ever of pinball as art. And that exhibit, I believe, opened in the Dunlop Art Gallery in Regina, Saskatchewan, and then traveled to 6 other venues across Canada that year and the year following. It got a lot of press. API picked it up. He did a catalog for the exhibit, which, to my knowledge, was the first time that this subject had ever been treated in a serious, almost academic way. But a guy named, I have to stop and think now. I was introduced to the catalog in Xerox form by folks who ran the first pinball sales store in New York City. It was called Pinball Patties, and it opened shortly after the ban on pinball had been lifted in New York. I got a hold of this catalog, I got in touch with Morgan, and he became another one of the movers and shakers in the beginning of the hobby. I continued to collect and started accumulating games that I remembered from my childhood. And at some point I realized, once I got beyond about 5 or 6 games, I decided, well, geez, you know, if I'm going to collect these things, I better know how to repair them. So I picked up and I flew out to Oklahoma City, and I spent a week with a guy named Cal Clifford, who was an old operator. And Cal ran a place called Cal's Coin College. And I said, Cal, I want to learn how to fix Gottlieb wood rails. And he said, well, come on out. And I don't have any classes the week of so-and-so. And I think it was the hottest week of the year. It was the end of July. So I went out and I spent a week drinking whiskey and learning how to fix Gottlieb pinballs, and emerged as a certified Gottlieb pinball repairman. So I became independent, and I then started collecting with greater interest and fervor. I think it may have had something to do with the failure of my first marriage, but we won't go there. I got to the point where I had so many machines that I realized I've got to have some plan for this stuff. I can't just keep accumulating. And once I left my big house up in Westchester County, New York, and moved into a city apartment, all of my stuff went into storage. And by the time I got to the point where I donated the collection to this museum, to the PPM, I had 5 warehouses of pinball games, 4 of them in Poughkeepsie, New York, 1 of them in Pennsylvania, and a significant number of them at my home in Orlando, Florida. The move from the East Coast to the West Coast was monumental. We had 2 of the largest tractor trailers packed to the gills, plus a large rental truck, and the whole process took the better part of 2 weeks. But now they're home. They live in the Pacific Pinball Museum. Many of them appear at the Pinball Expo here, and at some point we hope that we'll be able to line them all up, all 240 of them, in chronological order, and people will be able to walk down the history of Gottlieb games and play every one of them. So the thing has come full circle. Out from under my $1,000 a month storage. The games are in good hands. I can come see my children once a year, and the world is fine. The game I'm standing in front was one of my childhood favorites. As you can see, it's called Niagara. Niagara for many years was the #1 honeymoon destination of young people getting married here in America and in Canada. The back glass has got some interesting aspects. This is clearly an anachronism. It's supposed to depict a Frenchman by the name of Blondeau, who did indeed walk across the falls on many occasions, but that was in the latter part of, or the mid part of the 1800s, I believe. The straw boater is kind of another anachronism. Parker did this frequently. He reached back in time, probably to his youth, and captured some of the things that were going on. Some of the kind people that are helping us today, among them is Ruth, who pointed out that the couple here is kind of a takeoff on Dagwood and Blondie, and I think she's probably correct about that. As you can see, there are hearts ascending as the two greet and kiss. Here we have on the playfield, if that's visible at this point, we have an auto gyro, which is again a retro reference back to the 30s. We have the traditional guy going over the falls in the barrel, and all sorts of madness going on. Blondeau is being hit with a fish that the guy in the auto gyro has caught. Here's a guy going over the falls in a boat. Here's another guy going over in a barrel, and he's got a lobster on his toe, so he's really doing it right. He reprises the kissing couple on the playfield. This is an interesting aspect. There are very, very few Gottlieb games where there were graphics beneath the flippers on the playfield. This is one. I'm trying to think of another that I believe Crossroads did this, but it was kind of an unusual thing. This was the game on which Wayne Nyens chose to introduce the trap hole. And the trap hole is an interesting concept because it had a number of functions. One of them was simply to shorten playtime and make sure that the operator was getting the biggest bang for his buck. But the other was that it changed the topography of the playfield, because without any balls in the hole, you were looking at one situation, but any time it started to fill, as I said, the topography changed, and the balls could either aid or inhibit what you were trying to do. But Wayne's theory was, if you're going to lose a ball, you ought to be able to get something for it. It should be worth having lost the ball. Well, in this case, a couple of things happen. First of all, you get 500,000 points. 500,000 in score, not to be confused with points. These score points, 1 point apiece when they're lit. Other objectives on the playfield score, denominated in millions. What happens here are a number of things. Each time you fill one of these holes, it lights a corresponding 1 point bumper. So if you're lucky or unlucky enough, depending upon how you look at it, to fill all 4 holes and still have 1 ball left to play, you're in a situation where you have all 4 of these lit, and you can bang away and really rack up those points very quickly. The other thing that happens is, if you fill all 4 holes, you're given a replay for doing that. Another nice feature is this is a sequence feature. You have to put these bumpers out in sequence. I think I'll turn the game on and we can do it for real. Looks like the 3 is burned out, so let's pretend it isn't, but we hit the 1 first, then the 2, then the 3, then the 4, then the 5, then the 6. Once you've done that, this center rollover lights for special. And every time you roll over it, you get a free game. And another, and another. So it's a high knocker situation. And see our little friend here? I'm going to reset it and watch as he descends in his barrel. Nice little piece of backlit animation. Come on. Okay, number 1. He starts out at the top, just about going over the falls. Whoop. He's maybe questioning whether this was a good decision or not. There's no turning back now. So what we were doing before we had the malfunction on the machine, I was trying to show how the sequence of bumpers backlit our ill-fated guy in the barrel going over the falls. So now when I hit number 5 and number 6, we see him down here crash landing on the rocks. So it's a nice piece of backlit animation. Let me, if I can, light all 4 of these bumpers. And as I promised, when you have all 4 of them lit like that, you can very quickly rack up a heck of a lot of points, and consequently, a heck of a lot of a free game. It's a high knocker game. It's a lot of fun, and it's historically important because it was the first game that provided the template for the modern bottom, that being 2 cyclonic kickers flanking 2 flippers in the now modern position. So it was a watershed game, no pun intended, and it did quite well. One of my favorites, and I believe one of Wayne Nyan's favorites, along with Queen of Hearts, which is both his and my very favorite game. Folks, this is a kind of an interesting game. It was built by Genco in the early 50s. Genco was more of a factor in pinball prior to World War II than after World War II. Genco was founded by the Gensberg brothers, also a Chicago firm. During the 50s, when they were making pinballs, they ran a poor 3rd or 4th to Williams and Gottlieb, but they did do some interesting things. This game, as you can see, is called Springtime, and it's distinguished by the fact that it not only has a horizontal playboard, it's also got a vertical playboard, which is very like a Japanese pachinko. And I don't think that the production runs on these games were particularly strong. If Gottlieb was running averagely 900 or 1,000 games, perhaps Genco was running 300 or 400. So I don't think a lot of these survive. The way the game worked was that, let's turn it on and give a little demonstration. It's probably worth demonstrating this game. The features are kind of interesting. You have a channel here, which they refer to as a ball lift. And anytime you put a ball in any of these 3 kick-out holes, it moves balls up this channel and into this area here, where they remain suspended until you go over the rollover at the very bottom of the game, at which time they're released. So let me give you a demonstration here. Kind of fun. Set in many cases so that the rebound puts it right back into the hole. Oop, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So let's get all the balls up into the holding area, and then let's see what happens when you go through the ball release. Kind of fun. So you really have kind of 2 games in one, and Genco took advantage of this format and made 3 or possibly 4 upright gambling machines, which were little more than this, with a solid base that was of the same dimensions. And they run those as gambling pieces. They usually were on a nickel a play. They had a very small footprint, and you could win up to hundreds of games depending upon what you scored on these essentially gambling games. One of them was called Golden Nugget. I disremember the names of the other 2 or 3, but they did quite well with those, and they were rather inconspicuous. They could be operated in places where gambling pieces weren't legal, and they kind of flew under the radar. But this is an interesting piece. Most people that visit the Expo say that they've never seen one. Genco did make one other game in this format. I'm sorry, I can't recall at the moment the name of it, but to my knowledge, those were the only two games of this design with the bagatelle back box. Real interesting piece, probably Roy Parker art, the centerpiece being our lovely maid in her wonderful big sunbonnet. And of course, it's from the era where the reverse flipper was still prevalent and the preferred form of playfield configuration. Genco's Summertime. Interesting piece. The game we're looking at here is called College Daze. It was produced by Gottlieb in 1949, and it is a watershed game because it's the first game that the then very young Wayne Nyens, who in my estimation is the greatest designer of pinball to have ever lived, this was his first game. And he cobbled it up over a long period of time, probably a year or more, while he was doing other duties at the time. He was working at that time for Harry Mabs, who was the chief designer at Gottlieb, and the man who was responsible for the invention of the flipper. Legend has it that Mabs ultimately left Gottlieb because he felt he was entitled to something more than he received for the invention of the flipper, which, of course, changed pinball once and for all, turned it from a gambling game into a game of skill, and thus permitted it to be operated in municipalities where previously it was banned as being a gambling piece. It's a real neat old piece. It's got a football theme, which is something that, strangely enough, Gottlieb didn't do that often. It still has the reverse flippers that are characteristic of the time period in which it was made. It's got, as typical of a Wayne Nyens game, it's got multiple ways to win. The plastics on this have survived in surprisingly good condition. Almost every time I've seen a College Daze, the plastics have been what we refer to as toast. They're just crinkled up and awful looking. The back glass is a reproduction. It was one of a series of reproduction back glasses done by the Gang of 13, which was headed up by Herb Silvers. And Herb was the first one to produce or reproduce in any quantity back glasses from the Golden Age. As I said, there were 13 of us that were involved. We each paid a certain sum of money up front, and we got to designate the glass that we wanted to have reproduced. We were given 2 of our own, and then 1 of every other glass that was reproduced at the time. And that was one of the things that jump-started the hobby, and Herb is definitely due some thanks from an awful lot of collectors who have games now that they couldn't have imagined would ever have brand new back glasses. This was one of the games that I had commissioned through Herb. I did College Daze first, kind of as an homage to Wayne. I don't know too much about the play of the game. I've only played it half a dozen times. It was too early a game for me to have played as a child, so my only playing experience has been here at the show. Although it's a game that is in my collection, I was never able to get it set up and restored. But it is a landmark game, first designed from the creative mind of Wayne Nyens. This is Chicago Coin's Thing. Interesting piece. Chicago Coin was one of the also-rans in pinball. Gottlieb and Williams, again, being the 2 flagship marks, if you will. But Chicago Coin made some interesting pieces, and Thing is one of them. Thing is based not too loosely on a novelty record recorded by Phil Harris at about 1950. And the gist of that novelty record was a guy was at the seashore, and he found this elaborately wrapped box, which we see here and here and here, and replicated on the playfield. And it turns out there was something really evil in the box, so he wanted to try and get rid of it, but despite his best efforts, he couldn't. It was a popular novelty song, and in typical pinball fashion, somebody glommed onto it as an idea for a theme for a pinball game. This plastic here looks absolutely pristine, and there's a reason for it. It was reproduced for us by Wade Krause, who's done a lot of those kinds of things, which have helped the hobby and helped collectors immensely. It's a fun game. Clearly you can see that one of the things that you want to do is to put out the bumpers that spell out thing. This mystery area contains a a kick-out hole, and what you score is dependent upon other objectives that you made on the playfield, so it's a mystery score, and the ball disappears and you don't see it. It drops into the gobble hole, counts down the score that you've accumulated, and then kicks it out. This is a rare instance of a manufacturer other than Gottlieb using a blocking gate. This is configured differently than the traditional Gottlieb blocking gate, but nonetheless the principle is the same. I honestly don't recall the rollover in the runway brings it up at the beginning of the game. I honestly don't recall when it drops. It probably has to do with reaching a certain scoring objective on each ball, at which point the gate drops and you have a pretty wide open playfield at the bottom. As is the case with the Gottlieb bottom gates, it resets for each new ball. I hesitate to say who the artist is on this piece. It could be Parker, but I don't think it really is. Although the zeros have that fried egg look that was typically Roy Parker, so it might have been a Parker. Interesting piece. I don't think too many of them survive. This one came from my collection. Unfortunately, the cabinet had been repainted. The original cabinet had wonderful artwork that was echoing the scenes on the back glass. So at some point, if this hasn't been too badly abused, we might be able to remove the overcoat and get it down to the original graphic. I've had great success doing that. And usually the sloppier the job of the overpaint, the easier it is to get it back to the original. What I use is 4/0 steel wool and a little bit of some kind of a solvent and a lot of elbow grease. It takes about a full day to do a game in that condition. And usually you can get it back to pretty much its original paint scheme. Chicago Coins Thing, 1951. This game is Gottlieb's Harbor Lights. I believe it's a 1956 or early 1957. I can't recall exactly the date, but it's kind of an interesting and pivotal piece in many ways. It's one of a large number of Gottlieb single gobble hole multiple special games, where by building up certain features and dropping your ball into the gobble hole, you could win from 1 to, in some cases, as many as 10 games at once. And you could do that more than once if you had another ball or two left over. Other games that shared that feature were Frontiersman, Wishing Well, Easy Aces, Derby Day, Classy Bowler, and actually several others. It was a very popular format. And I believe the last game that where it was utilized was Sweethearts, which was well into the 60s. I once asked Wayne Nyans, why Gottlieb discontinued the multiple special gobble hole feature, which I particularly liked. It was one of my favorite features on Gottlieb games. And he said that the Europeans really hated the gobble hole. And Europe was a huge market for them in that era, and they had to acknowledge the wishes of the distributors and operators abroad, and that's what killed the gobble hole, because seemingly they didn't care that you could maybe win up to 10 games. They just felt it was an entrapment and a kind of a sneaky feature, and they didn't like it. They liked games that played longer and that didn't have that feature. So it was somewhat short-lived, but that list that I gave you are among some of the most fun and best playing games of the golden age. You see on this game, if you're able to catch this, Will, there are metal legs. That was a very recent feature at the time Harbor Lights was introduced. The last game that was a complete wood rail, complete from back box to floor, was Gottlieb's Frontiersman. The first game that carried the metal legs, I believe, was Easy Aces. You see here a metal tray as opposed to the wood apron that appeared on earlier games. This was the first game with the metal tray, and the very next game, the metal tray was made to extend beyond where it sits here, so the ball shooter gauge was actually part of the tray from that point on. So this is unique in that sense. It's the only Gottlieb game that has the metal tray that does not incorporate the ball shooter. So if you need that part, you're going to have to find it from another Harbor Lights. Tough thing to find. Another innovation that happened here on Harbor Lights were these center hit targets. If you hit the target on the outside, it scored 50,000. If you managed to hit the pin in the middle, it lit the corresponding letter, in this case D. So we had A, B, C, and D. And one of the things that you wanted to try and do when you played this game was to light each of these. Excuse me, let's play it. Here's a hit that's not on the center. It scores 50,000, which is kind of a nice feature, backlit in the lighthouse on this ridiculous back glass. But if I hit this in the center, it lights the D, lights the B, lights the C, lights the A. Now the hole's lit for a special. And a lot of things can happen, because if you continue to accumulate, every time you hit this, it not only lights the corresponding letter, it also scores a point. So as you can see, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. If I continue hitting those centers, I can actually win games on the points that I've scored. So in addition to lighting the hole, you can advance the point scoring and win games that way. There's another one, and another, and another. And now this is extra special because I've advanced it up to 9. If I keep hitting those centers, I can move it over to super special at the same time that I'm winning games on points. And every once in a while, this will light for double. So if I recall correctly, when it's lit for super special, you get 3 games in the hole. And when it's double, I believe you get 6 games. So let's see if that holds true. Here we go. Went from 7 to 11. So it didn't give me the 6, it only gave me 4. I guess I misremembered. Neat feature about this game that you didn't see on many Gottlieb games, recovery shooters. Really fun feature. And when the games were new and released, these were calibrated to hit those center pins. Now, a game that's been around for 50 years, it's not always going to do it. But in most cases, it does. So you were kind of between the devil and the deep blue sea as to whether you wanted to risk putting it in the recovery thing or use the flipper and try and target it that way. Really, really fun game. Definitely what you would call a bottom playing game. The configuration of the pops and the dead bumpers up here, while they are the only places other than the gobble hole where you can score a significant score, are kind of positioned in such a way that you're not going to be able to spend a lot of time upstairs. The other thing is that the 2 centrally located targets are positioned such that it's very hard to avoid the drop hole if you come down that channel instead of either of the 2 side channels. But all in all, a great playing game, one of my very favorites. I remember playing it only in one location as a kid growing up. It was in North Philadelphia on York Road and Erie Avenue, I believe, a little ice cream and candy store. And I played it new, and it was absolutely gorgeous, and I don't know how many nickels I pumped into it, but it was one of my favorites. The game that you see here is Gottlieb's Slugging Champ from 1955. The 50s, as you probably know or have read, was a time where baseball was pretty much at its peak. I guess the only time where it might have been more popular was in the 20s and the days of Ruth and Gehrig. But Gottlieb returned to the baseball theme in a standard pinball format many, many times. Williams, on the other hand, their competitor at the time, was heavily involved in baseball machines, but they were all pitch and bats, opportunely released in March or April to take advantage of that year's baseball season. Sluggin Champ is different. It's a traditional pin game. As you see here, the names of the cities where the various teams were competing are arrayed on the side of the back glass. Notice that they did that rather than name the teams, because you get into some kind of a copyright issue or trademark issue. It's an interesting game. There are a number of ways to win. First of all is the traditional way, winning on score, which is denominated in millions. You could also win on RBIs, and RBIs were essentially a way of making points relevant to a baseball game. So think of them as points or RBIs. It had an interesting progressive scoring system. The targets, the 4 targets on the playfield, scored an RBI every time you hit them, but it was progressive. So on ball 1, each target was worth 1 RBI. By the time you got to ball 5, each target was worth 5 RBIs. So you could have 3 or possibly even 4 miserable balls, and on that last ball just bang away and win replays. The other feature that was of interest, as you see, we had both the National and the American League, and these rollovers and the bumpers on the playfield corresponded to those team names. If you completed either league, it would light one of the holes for special, and that rewarded 2 games. If you completed both leagues and put out all the rollovers, both holes would light for an 8-game special, and dropping either of those holes awarded 8 games. Very fun game. It also had the distinction of being the only Gottlieb game that was put in both a standard cabinet like this and in what they call the deluxe cabinet, which had otherwise been reserved exclusively for the multiplayers of that day. So you will see this game in this format, and also on occasion in a much larger cabinet with the so-called belly bar on the front. Interesting piece, lots of fun to play, and a lot of crossover interest from people that are baseball collectors. Larry's an avid collector. He collects both wood rails and what we term wedge heads because of the appearance of the back box, and almost exclusively Gottlieb games. This game is notable for a number of reasons. Number one, it was designed not by Wayne Nyans, but by his successor, Ed Krinsky. Krinsky designed a great number of Gottlieb games during the 60s and 70s. And there are 2 features about the game that are notable, actually many features. One of them is that every time you go over a rollover or hit a target, the corresponding pool ball appears in the back box. You see these lanes here? They're called return lanes. They were a feature that was added to the game and became the kind of archetypal Gottlieb bottom for many, many years. Apparently Gottlieb or Krinsky designed this into an earlier game, but this game was released first. So it is indeed the first game with what became the typical Gottlieb bottom with a return lane, which was a feature players loved. It was like getting new life, even though you were draining the ball it wasn't terminal as it would be on one of these outside lanes. On the inside lane, you got your ball back, you got to shoot it again and got new life. The other thing that's notable about the game is that it's an add-a-ball game. The reason add-a-ball games came about was that there were certain territories, among them Wisconsin, Connecticut, Texas, and probably a few other areas where no pinballs were legally operated. The ordinances prohibited them and deemed them to be gambling machines. So to get around the fact that you couldn't even operate a game that gave free games, Alvin Gottlieb, in conjunction with his design team, came up with the idea of an add-a-ball. So you couldn't win a free game, but you could add balls ad infinitum, really, on a game that you were playing. If you were skillful enough, you could play for hours at a time, never winning a free game, but continually keeping or increasing the number of balls that you could play that were additional to the 5 original. Kind of a landmark game, again, part of the Larry Zartarian collection, and a fine example of an early, or I should say mid-60s game. Following up on the last game that we saw, this is the first ever add-a-ball game. Concept developed by Gottlieb, again in response to the fact that games, even those that simply rewarded replays, were not permitted in many areas of the country. It's interesting that they named this game Flipper. Legend has it that when they first came out with flippers on pinballs on Humpty Dumpty back in 1947, Wayne Nyans and a number of other people wanted to call it Flipper. But David Gottlieb prevailed and it became Humpty Dumpty. And Humpty Dumpty was the beginning of what they called the fairy tale series. And I think there was a lot of calculation involved in that decision because pinball was trying to separate itself from its somewhat seedy beginnings and what could be, you know, more pure and unadulterated than fairy tales. So I think they wisely chose to do that. But Wayne never forgot the name Flipper and decided that he would resurrect it and call their first game in the add-a-ball series Flipper. It's a neat piece. It's distinctive for a number of reasons. It was one of just a handful of games that were made in both the wedge head format with steel rails and in a wood rail version. Some of the early games, or certainly the prototypes and the sample games, and probably some from the early production line, came out with the wood rail format, and those are rare. There are probably less than 50 of them made at the outset, and just a handful of them that survive today. But this is a watershed game. It's a pretty game. It's fun to play, and a lot of people prefer to collect these rather than to collect replay games because the inherent reward is still there with an add-a-ball, whereas if you're paying nothing to play a replay game, the replay becomes meaningless. So there is a preference among many collectors for the add-a-ball rather than the replay. The game we're looking at now is the Queen of Hearts. It was again designed by Wayne Nyans with artwork by Roy Parker. I happen to think that the back glass is one of the most beautiful ever made. They made quite a few of these. It was a very, very popular game at the time. It happens to be designer Wayne Nyans' favorite game of all those that he designed over a period of almost 30 years. It also happens to be my favorite game. I remember playing it for the first time and many times thereafter on Long Beach Island in New Jersey in a town called Beach Haven. There was an amusement arcade called The Beacon, and they had a lot of 50s wood rails at that time. I guess I played Queen of Hearts for the first time in probably 1954, 55. I played it every summer when we returned there on vacation. I never forgot the game. When I started collecting seriously as an adult, I pursued it, and was delighted to be able to find one. I restored it. I ultimately owned 3 of them, restored 2 of the 3, and donated, I believe, 2 of them to the museum, and 1 of them I traded with another collector for a game that I wanted. It's an absolutely spectacular game. It does what every pinball machine would like to be able to do. It engages people on 5 different levels. There are 5 ways to win on this game, and this was one of the hallmarks of a Nines design game. I'm going to talk you through it and show you just how interesting the game is. Probably the least interesting of the features and ways to win is to light all 4 of the suits. And you do that by rolling over the rollovers at the top of the game. So you put out the diamond, you put out the club, you put out the heart, you put out the spade, and what that does is light one of the 4 top rollovers for special. In this case, had I actually been playing a game, because the spade happened to be lit, when I had put the spade out, I would have simultaneously gotten a free game. But that alternates every 10,000 points from one of the top 4 rollovers. So that's a moving special. It's hard to put them all out. The risk to reward is not great, so it's usually a feature that people only win on almost by happenstance. It's not one that's worth actively pursuing, but that is one feature. A second feature is the typical score denominated in millions, which was part of virtually every game that Gottlieb made during the Golden Age. Another very nice feature was the sequence feature. And when I say sequence, please don't interpret it to mean strict sequence. You do have to put them out in order, but you can hit other things in the interim. It's not like you have to hit the 1 and then immediately hit the 2. But let's just go through the sequence and see what happens. So we get the 1, which you probably want to do right out of the ball chute if you're going to play for sequence. The 2 is on the rebound rubber here. The 3 is on the side rebound rubber. The 4 is up here in the corner. The 5 is here, and the 6 is there. Once you've made that sequence, which is harder than it looks, you've got roll under gates on either side, power channels, which I love. It's a feature that I personally favor on all games. But these 2 channels are now lit for special in either direction. So you can win by coming down the playfield and through the special, or you can win by going up through the special. It's a real high knocker situation. So you have 4 ways to score special on those 2 roll unders. You can also win on points, and points you get 1 at a time. And this is the way I used to play when I was a kid. I would always play for these bottom rebounds that scored 1 point every time you hit them. And if you became skillful, you could catch it on the end of the flipper, hit this side, give it just enough of a bounce to go to this side and get 2 points at a time. The 1 point here is a rollover button. That's lit occasionally, and that's determined by the rivets on the 10,000 stepping unit. So it appears random, but indeed if you know the sequence, you could figure out when they light. Same thing with the pop bumpers. They light occasionally. This must be set up on a conservative setting. The operator had the opportunity to make it either liberal or conservative, depending upon where he plugged the connectors in. In a conservative setting, these would light less frequently. In a liberal setting, they'd light more frequently. But you could score points by hitting these, or by rolling over this, or by doing what I indicated earlier, hitting the side rebound rubbers. So that's a point, a point, a point, and once these were lit, you could really rack away. But as soon as you hit something other than the lit point bumpers, they would go off. So you wanted to keep it among this area and not hit the rebounds here, because they're on. Whoop. They're on now, and as long as I hit nothing but points, they're going to remain on. But if I score a 10,000, they're gone. So you could get quite a few points, but they lit somewhat infrequently. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the game, and yet the one that was least actively pursued, was the poker hands. There are 5 drop holes. This was the first game ever to feature the drop hole. It was a kind of a revolutionary idea at the time. Wayne got a lot of resistance. His management said, who's going to want to play a game where the ball just drops into the hole and disappears? And he said, well, we got to give them value for it. So what happens is, if you get 1 ball in each of those 5 holes and essentially score what would be a royal flush, I think it awards 2. Yeah, you could also win for a full house. I think you won 5 games for a full house. But the big knocker situation was to get 5 in a single hole, but that almost never happened. And what usually happened was players would resort to this if they got to their last ball and still had an opportunity to score one of those combinations. But 5 ways to win, a super popular game on Roots. It was later copied or near copied by Nyans in Poker Face, which was essentially the same layout except for a recovery shooter in the middle and an extra hole up here. Great game, one of my favorites, also favored by mega collector Sam Harvey and a lot of other folks that are into the wood rails.